Okay, so I'm back, and let's talk about compassion in the Old Testament. Now, some of you might right now be thinking, compassion in the Old Testament? I don't think those two things go together, because the Old Testament is about judgment, and it's about war, and it's about retribution and vengeance and all of those kinds of things. Well, I mean, it's hard to escape, especially in the earlier books of the Old Testament, this idea that the Lord is a warrior on behalf of his people Israel. So that's true. However, as with all things biblical, there is another side. In fact, one of the books that on Old Testament theology that I enjoy quite a lot is Walter Brueggemann's book on the Old Testament, in which he calls it Old Testament theology. It's narrative, counter-narrative, or testimony, dispute, and advocacy. So there is almost like this Hegelian idea that there's a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. And that kind of forms the way Brueggemann thinks about the Old Testament. So while, yes, there is judgment in the Old Testament, but there's judgment in the New Testament too. And so the idea that the New Testament is all peace, love, and warm fuzzies, well, that's not exactly what's going on there either. In the New Testament, you have Jesus suffering, dying, being raised again for others, but there is that experience that Jesus has with the wrath of God, and the wrath of God is something that comes right out of the Old Testament, but so does compassion. It is not foreign to the God of the Old Testament. It is not foreign to our understanding of God from the Old Testament to think about the Lord God as compassionate. And thus, because, going back to what we said in the very beginning, that humankind is created in the image of God, it is not unreasonable to suggest that humans are to be compassionate as well. That should be, in a sense, a part of our spirituality DNA. So the text says over and over again that the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love. I want to point to a couple of places where you see this. The first time is in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. The New Revised Standard Version, instead of the word compassion, here, was on the wrong page. Instead of the word compassion, it says merciful and gracious. Instead of the Lord is gracious and compassionate, merciful and gracious. They are synonyms, but that's what you get from the New Revised Standard Version. If you check other translations, commonly the word compassion is used. The same kind of idea permeates. The Lord, this is verse 6, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the thousandth generation, not easy for me to say, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, and so it goes on, right? So the focus here is that the Lord, Yahweh in the Old Testament, is merciful, gracious, and compassionate, that there is this sense in which God demonstrates his own willingness to be in the challenge with his people right there from the get-go. Now, what's happening in Exodus 34 is already Israel has been released from captivity in Egypt. There are these 10 plagues on the Egyptians, the first 3 of which are also on the Israelites, and then Pharaoh sends them out. Then Pharaoh's army is destroyed, and then the last part of the book of Exodus is about this beginning of the wandering in the wilderness and some of the events that happen between Egypt and then the land of promise into which Israel goes. And that's a story that's continued more in the book of Numbers than it is in the book of Leviticus, which follows right on Exodus. In any event, this idea that the Lord is gracious and compassionate is something that comes through with some regularity in the Hebrew Bible. It's not an unknown confession that we find in the Old Testament. And then the writers in the Hebrew Bible, they will kind of riff on that, if you will. They will explain what that compassion looks like, how God demonstrates that compassion and that mercy. All right, so I want to go to another passage, and that's Psalm 103. In Psalm 103, verse 8, here's just one place where that text from Exodus shows up again. Psalm 103, verse 8, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. He will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. So here we see that God, in verse 9, that God is a God who holds people responsible for sinfulness, and we're not going to talk about that right now, but it is fascinating, and I know especially in some of the helping professions, we see the impact that happens when people do things to their own bodies or to their families that cause destruction. Now, as a Christian theologian, I think in terms of sinfulness. You may not think in those terms, but I think we can say pretty safely that however you think about destructive tendencies, they raise their heads from time to time. And how does God respond to those? Well, that's a different course that we can talk about. But it does seem to state in the text here that whatever God's approach to sinfulness or to humanity's tendency towards self-destruction, he does not forever so deal with humankind. He will be gracious. He will be merciful. And I'm using the male pronoun because of two things. One, it's most common to me, owing to the tradition in which I grew up. It's certainly the gender that we see ascribed to God in the pages of the First Testament here, and in the New Testament as well. Understanding that really God is spirit, as Jesus says in John chapter 4, spirit, at least as far as we know, doesn't really have gender. So why does the Bible talk about God with respect to male gender? There are a number of reasons, not the only one, but certainly one of them is that in the ancient Near East, you had many female deity cults, Tiamat, Asherah, and we see those names in the pages of the Old Testament, and they were female fertility cults associated with those gods. And so what's going on, at least some of what's going on in the Old Testament, is distinguishing Yahweh, male supreme God, as different from the cult of these other gods that are competing for the loyalties of the people, right? So getting back to the matter at hand, we see God being one who is compassionate, merciful, long-suffering with his people in both of these texts, and not regarding destructive behaviors forever, not owing that to humankind's account forever, but there being some kind of end to that. And there's a way in which when you read the text, any of these texts surrounding this concept, that there is judgment, but judgment is always trumped by mercy. There will be a way in which mercy eventually, or compassion eventually, wins out. And I think that is kind of helpful for the helping professions. Sometimes people make mistakes and they pay for it, but there is hopefulness that it won't always be that way. And sometimes you all are the bearers of that hope. So we'll come back and talk a little bit more about compassion in just a minute. Digest those two texts, Exodus 34:6 and Psalm 103 verse 8, a little bit.